Ethan had graduated from East Point High in 2011, and after that, he swore he'd never step foot in that building again. The only exception was years later when his younger brother walked the stage. That day, he told himself it was the last time. What he had seen and felt in those halls had left a mark on him, one that never quite faded. East Point High wasn't just old. It carried the weight of its past like a living thing. Built in 1916, the school had once served as a makeshift morgue during the Spanish flu outbreak. The bodies had been stored in the basement, directly beneath what later became the theater classroom. Most of the basement was sealed off now, except for a few areas, the boiler room, a cluttered storage space, and a series of narrow passageways leading to rooms that hadn't been touched in decades. One of those rooms was different. A single classroom, perfectly preserved, as if frozen in time. No one knew why it had been abandoned, but if you angled a light just right through the small window, you could see everything still in place. Notebooks scattered on the desks, forgotten lunchboxes, pencils resting exactly where they had been left. It was as if an entire class had simply stood up one day and walked out never to return. With so much history steeped in tragedy, the weight of it had to go somewhere. It didn't just settle, it simmered beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to rise, and it did. Teachers whispered about sudden chills, the kind that sank deep into the bones. Others spoke of seeing shadows where there shouldn't be any, figures at the end of hallways that disappeared when they looked twice. It sounded like the usual ghost stories passed down from one generation to the next, until Ethan learned the school had proof. Actual photographs locked away in the administration office. Blurry shapes standing where no one should be, faces caught in reflections that didn't belong to anyone living. Over the years, stories piled up. A student who had taken their own life in the stairwell. A janitor who had fallen to his death after slipping on the wet basement floor. Groups of kids sneaking into the locked basement, laughing as they pulled out a Ouija board, only to leave shaking, pale, never speaking of what they saw. Ethan never gave it much thought. That is, until the day he saw something himself, and after that, there was no going back. Back then, Ethan was a theater kid through and through. At 6 even, built like a linebacker, people never let him forget that he should have been on the football field instead. But he didn't care. The stage was where he felt at home. By senior year, his schedule was light, leaving him with hours to kill. Most of that time, he spent in the theater or the attached classroom. It became his second home, a place where he could just exist without the constant noise of the rest of the school. He even ate lunch on the stage most days. Sometimes friends would join him, but more often than not, he was alone, and that was fine. He liked being alone, at least until he realized he never really was. That day at lunch was like any other. Ethan wandered into the theater, flipped on the lights, and pulled out his half-squashed sandwich from his backpack. With no mobile data and no clue what the school Wi-Fi password was, he settled for listening to music on his old iPod Touch. It was routine, comfortable. Then, as one song ended, the silence was shattered. Above him, from the catwalk, came a deafening crash, like someone had just tripped, sending a whole box of silverware clattering to the floor. The sound echoed through the empty theater, sharp and metallic. His head snapped up. And there, staring down at him, was someone he didn't recognize. The figure stood right at the edge of the catwalk, torso fully visible over the railing. Too close, too far forward. Almost like they were leaning over just a little too much. Their dress caught his attention, first big, puffy, something straight out of an 80s prom. The fabric looked faded under the dim theater lights. Ethan waved, called out, asked if they were okay. No response. He stood up, louder this time. Still nothing. The figure just stared. Ethan barely had time to process what he was seeing. He took a breath, about to call out one more time, then the figure faded. Not like someone stepping back into the shadows. Not like a trick of the light. It was as if they were dissolving, piece by piece, growing fainter until there was nothing left. A cold sweat hit him instantly. His body reacted before his mind could. His skin went clammy, his armpits damp, and in the sheer panic of the moment, he let out an involuntary fart. But there was no time to be embarrassed. His heart was already hammering, instincts screaming at him to move. He grabbed his backpack and bolted, his massive frame thundering out of the theater like a man being chased. He told his friends what had happened, breathless, still shaken. But they just laughed, told him to shut up, acted like it was all a joke. After that, Ethan never went into the theater alone again. Even with someone else there, the air always felt too heavy, too asterisk still. The shadows seemed to stretch a little longer. The silence felt too quiet. And worst of all, no matter where he stood on stage, in the seats, behind the curtain, he could feel it. The weight of unseen eyes, watching, waiting. The house was small, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood, the kind where every creak in the floorboards echoed through the walls. It had 2 floors, just enough space for 4 people, trying to make it feel like home. She lived there with her mother, her little brother, and her sister. She and her sister shared a bedroom, cramped but familiar, while her little brother had a room of his own. Their mother, however, slept downstairs, far from where the children lay awake at night. There was no running to her room for comfort when the darkness pressed in. Whatever fears crept into their minds after the lights went out, they had to face alone. She was around 7 or 8 years old at the time, old enough to feel brave during the daylight, but young enough to dread every shadow after dark. Her siblings were even younger, barely 6 or 7. And at that age, the imagination has a cruel way of turning harmless shapes into lurking nightmares. The house itself wasn't helping matters. Something felt off after nightfall, almost as if the place woke up once everyone else had settled down. Their mother tried to lighten the mood by joking about her imaginary ghost boyfriend, Jerry. But even then, she sensed something hidden beneath her mother's laughter, something strained and nervous. Maybe her mother was just as uneasy as the children, using humor as a shield against whatever waited in the darkness. The house changed when night fell. It wasn't just the usual creaks and groans of an old building settling. It was something deliberate. Footsteps moved through the halls, heavy and slow, yet no one was there to make them. Some nights, the sounds turned to stomping, as if something unseen wanted to be noticed, demanding attention in the dead of night. Then there were the voices, whispers that didn't belong to anyone in the house. They weren't loud, but they were clear enough to send chills through her spine. Soft cries drifted from empty rooms, sometimes nothing more than a faint weep, other times a call for anyone to listen. Objects had a way of vanishing, only to reappear in places they had never been left. It was as if the house, or whatever shared it with them, enjoyed toying with them. At the time, she never fully acknowledged what was happening. Maybe she was too young to question it, but looking back, the memories unsettled her. That house wasn't just strange, it was wrong. That night seemed normal enough, at least at first. Bedtime had rolled around like usual, but her little brother had mentioned feeling uneasy. It wasn't unusual. Fear had a way of settling into their bones as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon. Rather than leaving him alone with his unease, she and her sister decided to sleep in his room for the night. It made things easier. The room felt safer, not just because they were together, but because his window let in the soft glow of the streetlights outside. It wasn't much, but it was enough to cut through the darkness, making the room feel less like a void waiting to swallow them whole. Their own bedroom, by contrast, was pitch black at this hour. Worse still, it had a large closet one that always seemed to loom over them, its doors holding back whatever might be lurking just beyond. In her brother's room, things felt a little lighter, a little safer, at least for now. She had taken the spot closest to the edge of the bed, curled up on her side, half asleep. The gentle rocking of the mattress stirred her awake, but not enough to fully pull her from the haze of sleep. Her brother's bed was a loft bunk, high enough to leave space underneath, though that space was crammed with piles of clothes, too cluttered for anything to move around freely. Her eyes drifted lazily across the room, following the soft patterns of light reflecting off the walls. The glow from outside spilled into the hallway, just beyond the open doorway. That was when she saw it. A figure. A shadowy shape stood in the hall, just at the threshold of the room. It didn't move, didn't speak, only loomed there like a perfect silhouette against the dim light. At first, her tired mind tried to make sense of it. It looked like her mother, the shape, the posture, the outline of her hair. But something was wrong. It didn't breathe. It didn't shift. It was just there, still and silent, watching. A perfect mimic of her mother, yet completely, unmistakably wrong. Her breath hitched, her chest tightening as panic crept in. The air felt heavier, thick with something she couldn't name. She lay frozen, her wide eyes locked onto the figure standing in the hallway. The silence around her was deafening, her own heartbeat hammering loud enough to fill the empty space. Instinct took over. Without looking away, she reached for her brother, the only one close enough to wake. Her hands trembled as she shook him, desperate for some confirmation that this was real, that she wasn't alone in seeing it. She shook him once, twice, 3 times. He stirred, groggy, but she refused to let him drift back into sleep. Whatever was standing there, whatever was watching them, she needed to know that someone else saw it too. The moment she felt her brother stir awake, relief washed over her. Somehow, just knowing she wasn't alone made it easier to breathe. It grounded her, reminded her that she wasn't trapped in some nightmare. This was real, or at least she needed to know if it was. As he sat up, she swallowed hard, forcing her voice through the fear tightening her throat. Quietly, she asked if he could see it too. Her hand trembled as she pointed toward the doorway, doing her best to describe what she was seeing. He squinted into the darkness, scanning the spot where her eyes had been locked. The room was so dim, the shadows so deep, that doubt started to creep in. Was she just imagining it? Was it only her tired mind twisting shapes into something sinister? But the figure was still there, still unmoving, still watching. It was nothing but a silhouette, pure darkness in the shape of something familiar. There were no features, no eyes, no clothes, just a shadowy presence that swallowed up the dim light around it. The only thing distinguishable was its hair, and that was the worst part. It looked exactly like their mother's, the same curls, the same length, the same way it naturally rested, as if the figure had studied her mother and copied every detail perfectly. But it wasn't her. It couldn't be. It didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there, watching them, uncanny, silent, feeding off their fear. It lingered just outside the doorway, half hidden in the shadows, like it knew exactly how far it needed to stay to keep them unsure. The darkness swallowed most of it, but the hair, those unmistakable strands, remained visible, clear as day. That was how they knew it was real. How they knew it was still watching. She and her brother whispered back and forth, their voices hushed, filled with a mix of fear and desperate rationalization. They tried to convince themselves it was nothing, tried weakly to scare it off, hoping maybe, just maybe, it would react. But it never did. It only listened, silent, still, patient, as if waiting. Her brother saw it now too. That was all the proof she needed. This wasn't a trick of her imagination, it was real. He called out to it first, his voice small but certain. "Mommy, we see you." Then again, "We know that's you, Mommy." Looking back, the thought of them even believing it was their mother sent chills down her spine. It had so little detail, no face, no clothes, just that shadowy form, yet it mimicked her so perfectly that their fear convinced them. The fact that it knew what it was doing, knew it looked enough like their mother to deceive them, was the most horrifying part. At the time, Her childlike logic told her that maybe their mother was trying to scare them into going to bed. But she had woken up to that thing standing there. It hadn't come after hearing them whisper, hadn't appeared as a reaction to them being awake. It was already there, already watching. Still, they tried to convince themselves. If it was their mother, she'd react somehow, right? Maybe she was just standing there, doing that silent, disapproving stare that moms do when they want their kids to behave. Hoping to confirm this, they both laid back down, pretending to settle in for sleep. If it really was her, she'd move, say something, walk away. But it didn't. It just stood there, waiting. For just a second, she looked away. That was all it took. The figure moved. It didn't just shift or step back, it lunged. In an instant, it rushed forward, its shadowy form closing the distance with unnatural speed. But instead of coming for them, it disappeared under the bed. She and her brother jolted upright, their hearts slamming against their ribs. But instead of screaming or running, they exchanged wide-eyed looks, still convinced, somehow, that this was their mother playing some strange game. Driven by a mix of fear and misplaced trust, they hesitated before leaning over the edge of the bed, peeking underneath. Nothing, no movement, no shadow, no sign of anyone having been there. Only the messy piles of laundry, untouched, undisturbed. Her stomach dropped. A horrible realization settled in her mind, sinking like lead. It wasn't gone. It was still there. It was just underneath them now. Her brother didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The way he scrambled beneath his blanket, scooting as far from the edge as possible, told her everything. He was just as scared as she was. She did the same, pulling the covers over herself, pressing closer to her sleeping sister, as if that would somehow keep them safe. Her sister, blissfully unaware, remained fast asleep through all of it. Maybe that was for the best. Even now, she couldn't understand how they managed to fall asleep after that. Maybe exhaustion won over fear. Maybe their young minds shut down as a way to cope. But the memory never left her. That shadowy figure, that thing, had taken up space in her mind ever since. Whatever it was, it had watched them, mimicked their mother, played with their fear. And worst of all, even after all these years, she still had no idea what it really wanted. For years, they never spoke of it. Maybe it was fear, maybe it was denial, but whatever the reason, the memory remained buried between them, unspoken, yet never forgotten. It wasn't until much later, long after they had moved out of that house, that they finally brought it up to their mother. They expected her to laugh it off, to remind them of some silly game she had played that night, to give them a logical explanation that would put their minds at ease. But instead, she just gave a nervous laugh, a hesitant, uncertain sound. She had never heard of this happening before. And more importantly, she swore she had never done anything like that to them. That house had always been strange, she admitted. And deep down, they had always known it too. What they saw that night wasn't their mother, it was something else. Even now, the thought of it unsettled her, the way it had just stood there, waiting. The way it had run at them and vanished under the bed. The way it had looked just enough like their mother to make them doubt their own fear. She had more stories from that house, other strange moments, other eerie encounters. But nothing ever quite compared to that night. Because that night, something had studied them, tricked them, and for a moment, it had almost convinced them it was someone they trusted. She and her fiancé had a tradition whenever they traveled. They made it a point to go on ghost walks. It was never about actually believing in ghosts. It was about the experience. Most of these tours were the same. Some overly dramatic guide would lead a group through the city, spinning tales of haunted histories and restless spirits, trying to set the mood. They'd encourage people to take pictures, to feel the energy, to watch for something lurking in the shadows. It was cheesy, predictable, and honestly pretty funny. They had done it everywhere: Boston, Salem, Savannah, Texas, New York. No matter the city, the formula was always the same. And yet, it never got old. It was a harmless thrill, just another way to make memories. At least that's what they thought. Their latest trip had taken them to Key West, a place with no shortage of haunted history. Naturally, they had to do a ghost tour. This one started out like all the others, predictable, theatrical, and completely harmless. Their guide was a young woman, probably in her 20s, dressed up in old-timey makeup, doing her best to set the eerie mood. She led them through all the local hot spots, Robert the Doll's house, a late-night walk through a graveyard, a supposedly haunted bar. It was all standard fare. Nothing they hadn't seen before. She and her fiancé spent most of the time laughing, entertained more by the performance than the actual ghost stories. It was just another night, another city, another tour. But Key West had something different in store for them. The last stop on the tour was the Pirate Museum. By then, she and her fiancé were already cracking jokes, ready for another round of exaggerated ghost stories. But the moment they stepped inside, something felt off. A wave of nausea hit almost instantly. Her stomach twisted, rolling in a way that felt unnatural. At first, she brushed it off. Maybe she was just tired. Maybe it was the heat. Nothing to worry about. The guide launched into another story, this time about deaths that had supposedly happened there, about strange occurrences people had reported, just the usual ghost tour routine. But as the guide spoke, the feeling worsened. A sharp, sudden headache pounded behind her eyes, spreading fast. She reached out, gripping her fiancé's arm, the nausea intensifying. For a split second, she thought she was going to throw up right there in front of the whole group. Her fiancé turned to her, concern written all over her face. She asked if she was okay, but when she tried to answer, no words came out. Her throat tightened. The air in her lungs vanished. It felt like something had wrapped around her, squeezing the breath from her body. She wanted to tell her fiancé something was wrong, to say anything, but instead, she just nodded weakly and gestured that she was fine. She didn't want to seem stupid, didn't want to make a scene, even as her body screamed that something wasn't right. The guide led the group into another room, but by then, she could barely focus on what was being said. Her legs felt weak, her balance unsteady, and she clung to her fiancé, gripping her arm like a lifeline. The ground beneath her wasn't still, it shook, like the faint tremor of an earthquake, but no one else seemed to notice. Her stomach twisted violently, her body threatening to betray her at any second. She had never felt anything like this before. The only way to describe it was like being hit with the flu all at once, a relentless wave of nausea, dizziness, and feverish discomfort that wouldn't let up. It wasn't just the room or the air, it was something pressing down on her, filling her with an overwhelming sickness that made no sense. And the worst part? It wasn't stopping. It was getting worse. A high-pitched buzzing filled her ears, drowning out the tour guide's voice. Her vision blurred, her eyes stinging, and the world around her tilted dangerously. She was sure she was about to faint. And then she saw it. Standing in the far corner of the room, just beyond the group, was a figure. It wasn't a person. It wasn't even a shadow. It was something else. A blacked-out mass, darker than the dimly lit room around it. No face, no eyes, no defining features. Just a void, standing there, watching. Her breath caught in her throat. Every muscle in her body screamed to run. She opened her mouth to scream, but before she could make a sound, it was gone. Just like that. Vanished. Like it had never been there at all. That was it. She wasn't staying a second longer. She turned and ran, bursting out of the museum and into the open air, her heart slamming against her ribs. She didn't care what the others thought, didn't care if she looked insane. All she knew was that something had been in that room, and it had been watching them. The moment she stepped outside, the air rushed back into her lungs. She gasped, gulping it down like she'd been drowning just moments before. The nausea, the dizziness, the crushing weight, it was gone. Just like that. but her body still felt wrong. Stiff, heavy, like something had left its mark on her. That night, and for many nights after, the dreams came. Vivid, disturbing. Things she couldn't quite explain but would wake up sweating from. Even after they returned home, the memories clung to her, replaying in her mind when she least expected them. Her fiancé teased her, insisting she had faked it, that she was just getting too into the ghost stories. But she knew the truth. She would never forget what she saw, never forget how it felt. Key West wasn't just another haunted city on a cheesy ghost tour. It was different. It was the scariest place she had ever been, and she was never going back. Some ghost stories are just that, stories. Told for laughs, for thrills, for the fun of being scared. But sometimes something lingers. Something that doesn't fade when the tour ends or when the lights come back on. Some places don't just pretend to be haunted. Some places are. Maybe it was the Pirate Museum. Maybe it was something else. But whatever watched her that night, whatever pressed the air from her lungs and left its shadow in her mind, it didn't feel like a story. It felt real. And if Key West had taught her anything, it was that sometimes you don't go looking for ghosts. Because sometimes they're already asterisk waiting for you. If you've ever had an experience like this, something you couldn't explain, something that stuck with you long after it happened, tell your story in the comments. And if you're brave enough, maybe take a ghost tour of your own. Just be careful what you find, or what finds you.